My wife mocked my boundaries and burned through our savings until I ended her control, left the marriage, and built a life her downfall couldn't touch. Mantra: it's not your money, it's our money. At first it sounded fair enough, a hallmark of partnership in a marriage. But as the days passed, I began to notice what this principle truly meant in practice. My salary, earned through years of hard work and careful planning, became a communal pool for her spending whims. Each month I watched as our joint account bled dry. Extravagant parties, luxury clothing, and sudden emergencies from her side of the family always conveniently coincided with my payday. I grew up witnessing firsthand the destructive power of financial disputes. My parents' constant arguments over money had turned our home into a battlefield. Determined not to repeat their mistakes, I had set clear boundaries early in our marriage. I even laid out a budget, something we could both contribute to and live comfortably within. But every attempt to discuss limits was met with a dismissive wave or a quick shift of blame. "You're so uptight," she'd say. "This is what we work for, isn't it?" The breaking point came when I received a notification one morning, a nearly maxed out credit card. I opened the account statement and saw charge after charge, a high-end boutique, a lavish dinner for her friends, and an inexplicable $2,000 gift to her brother. My stomach churned as I calculated the damage. This wasn't just overspending, it was a blatant disregard for the financial stability we had vowed to build together. That evening I confronted her. "What's going on with the card? Why are we spending more than we're earning?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. She barely looked up from her phone. "It's not just your money. Stop being so controlling." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Controlling? We agreed on a budget and you're blowing through it like it's monopoly money. Her response was swift and sharp. "You don't get to dictate how I live my life. If you wanted a roommate, maybe you should have stayed single." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a fundamental difference in how we viewed partnership. For her, our money was a blank check. For me, it was a shared responsibility. The following week, I made a decision that would shift the dynamic of our marriage irreversibly. I called the bank and removed her access to our joint credit card. I transferred the remaining funds to a separate account and replaced the joint card with a basic debit card loaded with only enough for essentials. When she tried to use the card for another splurge and it declined, the explosion that followed was inevitable. "You're destroying this marriage," she screamed, throwing the card onto the table. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" I stayed calm, though every part of me wanted to fight back. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm trying to protect what we've built, even if you can't see it." Her fury only grew. She called me a miser, accused me of treating her like a child, and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Over the next few days, her anger turned into calculated attacks. She posted cryptic messages on social media about how controlling partners suffocate their loved ones. She called my mother, sobbing and telling her that I was ruining our relationship with my obsession over money. Every time I tried to reason with her, it felt like talking to a brick wall. It wasn't just the spending that hurt, it was the total disregard for the principles we had once promised to share. I had wanted a marriage where we worked together, where we supported each other and planned for the future. But at that moment, it was clear that our definitions of partnership were worlds apart. By the end of that month, I knew something had to give. I couldn't keep playing referee in a battle I had no chance of winning. My decision to cut off access to the joint finances wasn't about control, it was about survival. If I didn't draw the line, there would be nothing left for either of us. And yet, as I looked at her standing defiant and furious, I wondered if this marriage could ever recover from the damage already done. After I cut off her access to our joint finances, the house became a pressure cooker. Every conversation turned into a confrontation, no matter how trivial the subject. She saw my actions as an attack on her independence, while I saw them as a desperate attempt to regain control over a spiraling situation. The tension was unbearable, and yet I stood firm. I wasn't going to let my financial stability crumble because of her refusal to compromise. Her immediate response was to retaliate. The same night her card was declined, she launched a campaign of emotional warfare. She began with guilt trips, dredging up moments from our relationship to paint me as ungrateful or selfish. "I gave up so much to be with you," she would say, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and anger. "And this is how you repay me, by treating me like some gold digger?" When guilt didn't work, she turned to more public methods. Social media became her stage, and I was cast as the villain. Posts about financial control and toxic relationships began to pepper her accounts. always vague enough not to mention me by name, but clear enough for anyone who knew us to connect the dots. Friends started reaching out, some subtly questioning my behavior, others outright accusing me of being unfair. It was humiliating. She even called my family, hoping to rally them to her side. My mother, caught off guard by the dramatic phone calls, urged me to find a way to make peace. But how could I? Peace wasn't possible when every attempt to communicate was met with deflection and accusations. It became clear that she wasn't interested in resolving the issue. She wanted to win. I kept my resolve. From that point on, I provided a fixed monthly allowance, just enough to cover necessities like groceries and utilities. It was a practical solution, one that any reasonable person could work with. But for her, it was an insult. "You're treating me like a child," she spat one day, throwing the cash envelope onto the kitchen counter. "Is this what you want? A wife who has to beg for scraps?" I tried to explain again that this wasn't about control or punishment. "I'm trying to protect both of us," I said, my tone measured but firm. "If we don't manage our money now, there won't be anything left later." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that made my stomach turn. Contempt. "You've already destroyed this marriage," she said coldly. "Don't act like you're doing me a favor." The weeks that followed were a blur of escalating tactics. When emotional appeals failed, she tried to embarrass me further. She aired out every perceived grievance to our social circles, painting herself as a victim of my financial tyranny. She even staged dramatic phone calls while I was in earshot, sobbing loudly about how I had turned into someone unrecognizable. But her most calculated move came when she threatened to leave. "Maybe I should go," she said one evening, her voice dripping with venom. "Maybe you'd be happier on your own, hoarding your precious money." It wasn't the first time she had threatened to walk out during an argument, but this time felt different. There was an edge to her words, a finality. I almost called her bluff, but deep down I still hoped things could turn around. I wanted to believe that she'd eventually see reason, that we could find a way to move past this. Then came the moment I realized she wasn't interested in reconciliation, only control. One afternoon I came home to find she had cleared out the guest room and turned it into a makeshift office. She announced with an air of triumph that she was starting her own online business. "If you're going to treat me like an employee, then fine," she said. "At least I'll be my own boss." I was taken aback, not by the idea itself, but by the tone of defiance in her voice. It was clear she wasn't doing this to contribute or to prove her independence in a healthy way. She was doing it to prove a point, to show me that she didn't need me or my rules. I wanted to be supportive, but her approach made it impossible. Every step she took seemed designed to widen the growing chasm between us. By the end of that month, it felt like we were living in two separate worlds, mine grounded in practicality and planning, hers fueled by pride and a determination to prove me wrong at any cost. The foundation of our marriage, already cracked, was beginning to crumble entirely, and though I held out hope that we might find a way back to each other, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were hurtling toward an inevitable end. Her decision to start an online business seemed, at first glance, like a positive step. After weeks of tension and hostility, I thought perhaps she was channeling her frustration into something productive. She threw herself into it with a zeal I hadn't seen before, turning the guest room into her headquarters. Packages began arriving daily, boxes of accessories, sample kits, and design materials. Her laptop was always open, tabs filled with supplier websites, marketing guides, and tutorials on building an online store. From the outside, it looked like a genuine attempt at creating something meaningful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was less about building a future and more about proving a point. She made it clear that this venture wasn't for us. It was for her. "You'll see," she said one evening as she meticulously arranged items for a photo shoot. "I don't need anyone's help, least of all yours." At first, I stayed out of her way. I told myself that supporting her meant giving her the space to figure things out. But the way she went about it made neutrality impossible. Every step of the process was broadcast on social media, accompanied by captions that seemed designed to undermine me. Posts about betting on yourself when no one else does, and building from nothing flooded her accounts, each one dripping with passive aggression. Friends and followers flocked to the comments, praising her resilience and offering unsolicited jabs at me. "You're such an inspiration," one wrote. "Some people just don't understand what real ambition looks like." I ignored the noise, focusing on my own work and finances, but she made sure to bring her success into every interaction we had. "Did you see how many likes my post got today?" she'd ask, grinning. "People are really paying attention. Maybe this is my calling." Within a few months, her store started gaining traction. She managed to secure a few influencers to promote her products, and her sales began to climb. Packages were being shipped out regularly, and she was glowing with pride. It was hard not to admire her hustle, even if her motivations felt misguided. I congratulated her when she landed her first big order, but my words were met with thinly veiled contempt. "Surprised?" she asked, a smirk tugging at her lips. "I told you I didn't need anyone to believe in me." The more success she tasted, the more insufferable her attitude became. She made a point of flaunting her independence at every turn, refusing to acknowledge the support I was still providing, paying for the house, utilities, and even some of the supplies she was using for her business. Whenever I tried to have a conversation about balancing her newfound income with household responsibilities, she dismissed me outright. "I'm reinvesting," she'd say, waving off my concerns. "You wouldn't understand." Then came the turning point. She landed a lucrative contract with a boutique that promised to elevate her brand. She was ecstatic, parading the details in front of me as if it were a trophy. "You doubted me," she said, her tone triumphant. "But look at me now. I've done more in a year than you've done in a lifetime." Her words stung, but I kept my composure. "I never doubted your ability to succeed," I said carefully. "I just wanted us to succeed together." She laughed. A cold, dismissive sound. "Together? Don't act like you've been in this with me. You made it clear from the beginning that your money is yours. Well, guess what? My money is mine too." It was in that moment I realized there was no saving what we had. Her pride had grown into something unrecognizable, a force that eclipsed any sense of partnership we might have once shared. What started as a desperate attempt to prove her worth had morphed into a competition, one she was determined to win at any cost. I watched as she reveled in her accomplishments, basking in the validation of strangers online while our marriage became little more than a formality. Every success she achieved felt like another wedge driven between us, not because I resented her growth, but because she used it as a weapon. It wasn't about building a future anymore, it was about settling a score. By the time her business reached its peak, I had already begun to detach emotionally. I didn't hate her for what she was doing. In some ways, I even admired her tenacity. But the partnership I once believed in was gone, replaced by a war of egos that neither of us could win. The success she celebrated so loudly had come at a cost neither of us was ready to acknowledge, and deep down I knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in her newfound empire began to show. The day we sat across from each other in the lawyer's office to finalize the divorce was the day it truly sank in. This wasn't just a fight anymore, it was the end. The tension between us was palpable even as we tried to maintain a semblance of civility. By that point, the marriage had been reduced to numbers and paperwork. Love, trust, and partnership had been replaced by spreadsheets, bank statements, and legal terms. The division of assets was as bitter as every argument that had led us to this point. Her business was thriving on the surface, but the cracks were already starting to show. The boutique contract she had secured came with costs she hadn't anticipated, higher production expenses, shipping logistics, and marketing campaigns that drained her resources faster than she could replenish them. Still, she walked into that office with an air of triumph, ready to claim what she thought she deserved. We both knew the legal system was clear. Everything acquired during the marriage was to be split evenly. That included not just the assets, but also the debts. She didn't see it that way. "The debts are yours," she argued. "I didn't make those decisions. You did." I almost laughed at the audacity. The very credit card statements that had driven us apart were filled with her expenses. Luxury purchases, dinners, gifts to her family. But she refused to acknowledge any of it as her responsibility. The lawyer, to her credit, remained neutral, outlining the law with meticulous detail. "Half of the assets and half of the liabilities," she said firmly. My ex's confident facade faltered for the first time. She protested, of course. But it didn't matter. The numbers didn't lie. When the papers were signed and the division was finalized, I walked out with a sense of relief more than victory. My half wasn't extravagant, but it was enough for me to start over, a modest savings, the car, and my professional equipment. Tools I could use to rebuild my financial stability. She left with her business, a sizable chunk of our savings, and the apartment we'd shared. It was fair on paper, but I knew the weight of the debts would catch up to her soon enough. In the weeks that followed, she celebrated her freedom with an almost reckless enthusiasm. Social media once again became her stage. Pictures of champagne toasts, captions about starting fresh, and posts about how independence tastes sweet filled her feed. Meanwhile, I quietly got to work. I rented a small apartment, downsized my lifestyle, and focused on rebuilding my financial foundation. My priority was stability, not appearances. But the irony of it all hit me when I began hearing from mutual friends. Despite her public display of success and independence, she was struggling. The debts she had dismissed as ours were now very much hers. She had underestimated the cost of running her business without a financial safety net. Suppliers were calling about late payments, and her boutique contract was hanging by a thread because she couldn't meet production deadlines. Still, she refused to acknowledge reality. Instead, she doubled down on the narrative that she was thriving, posting pictures of herself attending networking events and flaunting new purchases. It was all a performance, a desperate attempt to maintain the image she had carefully crafted. But those closest to her started to see through the facade. They told me how she had begun borrowing money from friends, spinning stories about temporary cash to flow issues. Some helped her, while others distanced themselves, tired of the constant drama. I stayed out of it. For the first time in years, I felt no obligation to fix her problems or protect her from the consequences of her actions. She had made her choices, just as I had made mine. The final blow came when she reached out to me directly. It was the first time we had spoken since the divorce. Her tone was cold, almost businesslike, as she tried to argue that the division of assets had been unfair. "You knew I needed more to make my business work," she said, as though that was somehow my responsibility. She even hinted at taking legal action to revisit the settlement. But there was no basis for her claim. The agreement had been clear, and the court had approved it. When the call ended, I felt no anger, only a quiet sense of closure. This was who she had become, a person so consumed by pride and resentment that she couldn't see the truth staring her in the face. And as she continued to spiral, I focused on what mattered: my future, my peace, and the freedom to live without the weight of her choices dragging me down. It didn't take long for the glamour of her entrepreneurial journey to fade. The online store that had once brought her so much validation was now a source of constant stress. Orders slowed, and customer complaints about delayed shipping and product quality began to pile up. She tried to keep up appearances, posting motivational messages and updates about new opportunities, but the strain was evident to anyone who looked closely. Her pride, the same force that had driven her to create the business, became her greatest obstacle. Instead of admitting she was in trouble and seeking help, she doubled down on the facade. She began taking increasingly desperate measures to keep the business afloat. Friends told me she sold the car she had taken in the divorce and liquidated the small investments she had received as part of the settlement. She even took out loans, hoping a quick cash injection would solve her problems. But the hole she was in was far deeper than she realized. The boutique terminated their contract after multiple missed deadlines, and without their business, her sales plummeted. The loans she had taken only compounded her debt, and soon she found herself with no choice but to sell the apartment she had fought so hard to keep. She tried to spin the sale as a strategic move, but those close to her saw the truth. She was drowning. Eventually, even her social media presence began to crumble. The carefully curated posts became less frequent, and when they did appear, they were tinged with bitterness. She wrote about the struggles of being an entrepreneur and hinted at betrayal by people she had trusted. It was clear she was trying to shift the blame for her failures onto others, but the sympathy she had once received was now in short supply. People were tired of her excuses, and those who had lent her money were especially fed up. The final blow came when she was forced to move back to her mother's house in a small rural town. The woman who once flaunted her success and independence was now living in a cramped space with no car, no savings, and no viable income. Mutual friends told me she spent most of her time lamenting her misfortunes, blaming the boutique, her suppliers, and even me for how things had turned out. It was as if she couldn't fathom that her own decisions had led her to this point. For a moment, I considered reaching out. Despite everything, part of me felt sorry for her. But then I remembered all the time she had used my support against me. All the ways she had tried to humiliate and undermine me. Helping her now would only reopen old wounds, and I had worked too hard to rebuild my life to risk that. Her downfall wasn't dramatic. It was slow and inevitable. a consequence of years of ignoring reality and refusing to take responsibility. And while I took no joy in her struggles, I couldn't ignore the irony. She had spent so much time trying to prove she didn't need anyone else, only to end up dependent on her mother in a way she hadn't been since her youth. As her life unraveled, mine began to stabilize in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The divorce, as bitter and draining as it had been, left me with something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. For so long I had been caught in the chaos of her spending, her drama, and her need for control. Now, with the dust settling, I could finally focus on what mattered, rebuilding my life on my terms. The first step was regaining control over my finances. I created a detailed budget, not out of necessity but as a reminder of the discipline that had once defined me. It felt good to have a plan, to watch my savings grow, and to make decisions without the weight of someone else's demands. I downsized initially, moving into a modest apartment and cutting back on non-essentials, but I viewed it not as a sacrifice, but as a recalibration. My goal wasn't to impress anyone, it was to create stability. That stability allowed me to take a calculated risk. I used part of my savings to start a small business. It wasn't flashy or groundbreaking, but it was something I had always been passionate about. I poured myself into it, not with desperation, but with genuine purpose. Every decision, every investment was made with care, and over time the effort paid off. The business grew steadily, and with it, so did my confidence. Meanwhile, I heard occasional updates about her through mutual friends. She was still living with her mother, still struggling to find her footing. Her once boastful social media presence had dwindled to sporadic posts, mostly cryptic complaints about betrayal and hardship. She even tried to file a lawsuit against me, claiming the divorce settlement had been unfair. The court, unsurprisingly, dismissed it outright. It was a desperate move, one that only solidified the distance between us. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction when I heard these things, just a sense of finality. Her downfall wasn't my concern anymore. She had made her choices just as I had made mine, and while she continued to grapple with the consequences of hers, I was busy building a future that didn't include her. One day, while sorting through old files, I came across a photo from our wedding. It was strange to look at it, to see two people who had once believed they were building a life together. I didn't feel bitterness or regret, just a quiet understanding of how far I had come since that moment. Marriage, I realized, is about more than shared finances or surface-level compatibility. It's about partnership, respect, and a willingness to grow together. Without those things, no amount of money or effort can hold it together. Today, my life is calm, focused, and fulfilling. I've built a business I'm proud of, purchased a home that feels like mine, and learned to value my own peace above all else. There are no arguments, no drama, no need to justify my choices to anyone. I've learned that true freedom isn't about proving anything to others, it's about being content with yourself. As for her, I assume she's still searching for something she may never find. The freedom she celebrated so loudly has left her trapped, a victim of her own pride and refusal to adapt. And while I don't wish her ill, I no longer feel responsible for the life she's created. Our paths diverge the moment we prioritize different values, and there's no turning back. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. Looking back at that wedding photo now, I almost don't recognize the man smiling next to her. He looks hopeful, trusting, certain that love and good intentions would be enough to build a life on. I was so naive. I genuinely believed that if I worked hard, planned carefully, and gave her everything I could, we would grow together. Instead, I spent years watching my efforts disappear into designer bags, lavish dinners I was never invited to, and emergencies that only ever affected her side of the family. Every time I tried to protect what we had, I was painted as the villain, controlling, miserly, heartless. The truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of becoming my parents, terrified of waking up broken because I had handed over the keys to someone who saw my caution as cruelty. The hardest part wasn't the money, it was realizing that the woman I loved didn't respect me. She didn't see my boundaries as protection, she saw them as shackles. She didn't hear my pleas for partnership, she heard demands for obedience. And the worst of it? For a long time I believed her version of the story. I felt guilty for wanting accountability. I felt small for caring about savings accounts and credit scores. I let her convince me that wanting financial responsibility made me less of a man, less of a husband. But the day I finally closed that joint credit card, something inside me woke up. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I wasn't punishing her. I was refusing to punish myself any longer. When she screamed that I was destroying the marriage, I realized the marriage had already been destroyed the moment our money stopped, meaning our future, and started meaning her freedom, my burden. Watching her empire of pride collapse wasn't satisfying the way I once imagined it might be. There was no vindictive thrill, no I told you so moment that felt good. There was only a quiet sadness for the life we could have had if she had ever chosen us over me. I mourned the partnership that never truly existed. I grieved for the younger version of myself who believed love meant unlimited sacrifice. Yet out of that grief came the deepest peace I've ever known. Freedom isn't the new house or the growing business or even the healthy bank balance, though I'm grateful for all of it. Freedom is waking up without dread. It's making a budget and feeling proud instead of anxious. It's trusting my own judgment again. It's knowing, with absolute certainty, that no one will ever again weaponize my love against me. I don't hate her. I don't wish her harm, but I no longer carry her. The weight is gone, and in its place is something I hadn't felt in years: possibility. I am no longer the man who begged to be seen as generous while being bled dry. I am the man who learned that real generosity begins with generosity toward myself, protecting my peace, my future, my dignity. If I ever love again, it will be with eyes wide open. I will choose someone who understands that partnership isn't 50/50ths on the good days and 100/0ths on the bad ones. I will choose someone who knows that our money means our dreams, our security and future, not a blank check for ego. And most importantly, I will never again apologize for having boundaries. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see a man who survived, a man who rebuilt, a man who finally understands that the greatest investment I will ever make is in my own peace. And that, more than any amount of money, is true wealth.